Hello, my name is Charlie Hank, and I'm a member of the Historical Committee. As part of the Society's effort to document the centennial of our society, we are conducting leadership recall interviews with presidential members of Society. Today we're going to be interviewing William Collins, who was president of Society from 1975-1976. Good afternoon, Bill.
Good afternoon, Charlie.
Bill, I'd like to start off the interview by asking you to give us some background on yourself, where you grew up, where you went to school.
Well, I was born in a little mining town in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, in the Iron River. I went to school at the Michigan College of Mining Technology, as it was known then, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan at Houghton. It's now known as Michigan Technological University, but it was strictly an engineering school at that time, and graduated in 1935.
So you got a bachelor's degree in engineering?
Yes.
Mechanical engineering?
Mechanical engineering. Mm-hmm. They had, at that time, what they called several options in mechanical engineering. One was steam power, another was automotive design, and diesel engines, and one with heating and ventilating and refrigeration. And I had opted to take the latter option, and that's what I studied in.
I wonder if there were many colleges that offered that kind of an option. I know today there aren't even many colleges that offer that option.
I don't know about that, but in my final year, I got a copy of the ASH and VE guide, as it was known as in them days, and that was my first knowledge of ASHRAE. And it's interesting, I still have that copy of the guide. It's about 1 inch thick, about half of the size of the present books that we have, the handbooks. And in it included not only the technical information, but it had all the advertising, it had the directory, and it's the changes that have come about in the guide since that time, from the guide to the present day handbook, are tremendous.
Oh, they are. Of course, back then the guide was known as the Bible of the industry.
That's right.
So after you graduated from college, where did you start working?
I started working, I graduated in 1935, which was pretty much at the height of the Depression in our area, at least. And there were several options. One was to go with the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which a great number of graduates did. The other was to take any job you could find, whether it was what you had studied for or not. And I took a job with a packing company, Swift & Company, and went out to their produce plant in Clinton, Iowa, and as an assistant steam and refrigeration engineer. I looked at it as a fifth year of my college education, because at a rate of 35 cents an hour, why, it certainly wasn't necessarily a livelihood, but it was an expansion of my education. And from there I went on to the C.A. Dunham Company out in Marshalltown, Iowa, to work in their research and development area. And at that time they had a policy that in order for you to work in their research and development area, you had to work in all of the various sections of their plants at Marshalltown and at Michigan City, Indiana, for at least 2 weeks. So I had the pleasant experience of working in the foundry out there in Marshalltown, Iowa, when it was 114 degrees in the shade outside. But their idea was that they didn't want people in R&D who did not appreciate the difficulties involved in production processes. And after being with them for a period of time, I went with one of their branch offices down in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. And I've been there ever since, except for a few years back in 1942 to 45, when I was in what is known as WWII. After the war, I went back to Oklahoma, to Tulsa, to set up my own consulting firm.
So there you're doing design,
right,
on commercial buildings?
My first job was design of a 5-story hospital addition, which has many years ago been brought down and a new building in place of it. It's kind of tough when you do a job, your first job, and you go back and see the space has been, building has been blown down and something else is up there in its place. But then I stayed in the consulting field from then up until 2 years ago, when I retired from the design field And I had moved to Oklahoma City. After about 3 years in Tulsa, I moved to Oklahoma City because I had contacts in Oklahoma City that I had made when I lived there prior to World War II. And there weren't very many consulting firms in Oklahoma at that time. And so with the contacts I'd already made, it was better for me to move to Oklahoma City than Tulsa.
Start your business there. So, how did you get involved in ASHRAE?
Well, I got involved in ASHRAE. First, I went to a meeting in Chicago in 1949. I had not, in January of 1949. And this was right after I'd moved to Oklahoma City. And after I came back from that meeting, a fellow named Joe Patton, who was with Powers Regulator Company at that time, came into my office and said, "Bill, you need to belong to ASHRAE, or to ASH and VE." He laid an application down on my desk and said, "I'm not leaving until you fill out and sign it and give me the check." And I could see nothing wrong with that, so I gave him the check and became an active member of the chapter, and that led to getting into the field of the society activities. At that time, the society had, this was ASH and VE, had what they called a chapter's conference committee, which consisted of one delegate from each chapter to go to the annual meetings and conduct some of the business that our Regents Council now conducts. But one of the big things were to select members of the nominating committee. And I was elected to go for my chapter, and the second year that I went, a gentleman by the name of Rex Vernon from Johnson Service Company, and as it was known then in Milwaukee, was chairman of that committee, and the elected secretary did not show up. And Mr. Vernon had spoken at our chapter meeting of ours just a few months before, and he looked at me and said, "Bill, you're chapter secretary, you know how to take care of these things, you're going to be secretary of this meeting." So I was reelected secretary the following year and went on to be chairman of that committee.
Oh, fantastic. Now, in the chapter, you said you were chapter secretary. I assume you moved up through the chairs of the chapter.
I served in all the chapter chairs. In fact, I was chapter president in 52 and 53.
And then from your chapter activities, you got involved in regional activities.
That's right. Well, we didn't have the region at that time. ASH and VE did not have regions at that time. But at a meeting in Swampscott, Massachusetts, back in the, around 52 or 53, maybe 54, the society was considering going into the regional structure. And they asked the chapters to, each chapter to vote on whether or not they wanted to be in with a regional structure. And our chapter said no, but if you're going to go to a regional chapter and have a regional conference, let's have the first one here in Oklahoma City. And the regional structure did go through, and we had the first meeting in Oklahoma City, which was a trial balloon for regional meetings in 1955. It was not strictly regional in nature because we had people from all over the country and Canada at the meeting. And, but it did indicate that a regional meeting could be successful. And then ASH and VE went to the regional structure, and when we integrated, so to speak, with RE in 59, why the regional structure was maintained, except that the limiting lines of the various regions were changed a little bit. The boundaries, the limits were changed.
Tell me a little bit about the merger and your involvement at that point. Where were you in the
Well, when the merger occurred, I had just been elected to a 3-year term on the council, which is what the board of directors was termed then, a VE. And I served for a half a day until the merger vote was taken. And in the merger, the terms of all of the officers and directors were cut in two. So instead of having a 3-year term as a regional chairman, I had a 1.5-year term, and was subsequently elected to another 3-year term beyond that. But those days were interesting. The two societies, although they had decided to merge seemed to have some suspicions about each other, so to speak. And had a board meeting, and the board meetings were, I think some 46 in number, members of the board. There'd be the RE boys would be lined up on one side of the room, and the AE boys on the other. And because we were AE by then, we changed to AE in '55. And there was always somewhat suspicion between the two sides. And the meeting in Dallas, the winter meeting in Dallas, lasted till 1:30 in the morning. And I'll have to admit that the suspicion probably was not totally undue. There was a little bias on the part of the fellows from RE who wanted RE to be more in control, and the AE were the same way. But there was one gentleman, a subsequent presidential member, who's now deceased, John Doob, with Elko Controls at St. Louis. I think he was treasurer of the RE Society when we joined together, merged. And he was the only man in the room. He looked straight down the line, what is best for the new society. And I've got a great deal of respect for that gentleman.
You need somebody like that, too, to
That's right.
direct you and head you in the right path when that happens.
That's right.
It sounds like you did an excellent job. So then, when did you become a board of directors member?
At the time of the merger.
At the time of the merger,
Yeah.
Okay. So that's when you were
The regional chairman.
Regional chairman.
Of Region, well, it was Region 6 at that time.
Okay.
But it's what is now Region 8.
Region 8, okay.
But at that time we had Albuquerque was in our region, and they subsequently elected when they were in our region when it was changed to Region 6, when we went to the regional concept in 55, 56. They were in our region. Then when the merger came along, they elected to go into the adjoining region, which was 9 at that time, because they felt that their work conditions were more associated with the chapters in that region. And El Paso, which had done that earlier in the game, also did that, to say that. So Region 8 then consisted of Oklahoma, Texas, minus El Paso, Arkansas, and a part of Louisiana.
I see. So then after you were a board member, then you became an officer at what year?
I became an officer in '64. After my 4.5 years as regional chairman, I was elected vice president for a year. And I had an illness in the family, which resulted in the loss of my first wife. So I dropped out of the picture as far as the officer role was concerned. But I did maintain an interest in the society and stayed on various committees. In fact, I think I've been on a committee, some committee one sort or another ever since.
And then you became an officer again in the early 70s?
I became an officer again, let's see, that would be in the early 70s. I served as a vice president for 2 years, the president-elect 1 year, and then as president in 75 and 76.
At that point, in 75 and 76, what was happening in the world at that time?
Well, of course, the big issue at that time was the oil embargo and the energy crunch. The people were becoming energy conscious. The government was getting edgy about it, and that was certainly the big concern at that particular time.
So that was in like 1973 and leading on up?
73 on up.
And what was society doing at that point to try to alleviate some of this concern about energy use?
Well, Rod Kirkwood, 2 years previous to my term, had set up a committee which resulted in a standard committee to bring forth what we now know as Standard 90, energy conservation in buildings. And they worked on that for 2 years prior to my administration, and there was a lot of conflict in thoughts as to what should be in that standard. And part of it was a result of trying to ascertain where should we start to measure energy, at the point where it enters the building or at the point of its source, which brought the utilities, the electric and the gas utilities, into conflict with each other. And the riffs and the roughs, as they were known as in those days, presented a problem. And during my term, Bill Chapman, who followed me as president, he and I went to a special meeting of the Standards Committee in New York and prevailed upon them to bring the standard to the board for approval. They were trying to come up with a perfect standard, which certainly could not be obtained. And the general public, the government, the society, everybody was restless. We had to have a standard. So I hate to use the word pressure, but we had to pressure the committee to bring the standard to the board so that it could be approved and utilized. And I would say that I would consider that as one of the outstanding accomplishments of my particular term.
It was very outstanding, yes indeed. And well, not in your term, but of the history of the society even. It's an excellent standard. Did you have a theme during your presidential year?
My theme was commitment. I had heard a speaker many years, or several years earlier, speak on commitment. And he told a story about Joe Namath and how he was going to take his team to the Super Bowl or whatever the championship game was at that time. And I think they were to play Baltimore, which had a much higher rating. Every time anybody talked to Joe, they were going to win that game. And it got so that the people in Baltimore were wondering whether maybe he knew something that they didn't do. But he got his team committed, and they won the game. And commitment was a good theme for my term.
How did that commitment tie into the Presidential Award of Excellence for the year?
Well, I would say that it improved the activity towards the Presidential Award of Excellence. In other words, I asked for a commitment from all of the committees of the society, not only those of the regions or the chapters. And I think we got an enthusiasm engendered that brought out a good deal. In fact, at this point I'll have to brag just a little bit and say that my chapter won the Presidential Award of Excellence during my year.
Oh, great.
But they did not win the award of the region a month or two earlier.
Now, what other significant events happened at either the annual or semi-annual meeting that you can recall?
There are two things that I think of right offhand. One was I was invited or maybe challenged to come to the AGA meeting in Boston to discuss the Standard 90 and the energy standard. And I think that after visiting with them and speaking, addressing their society, their group, I think I allayed a number of their fears that they had about what effect the standard might have on the gas industry. And I think certainly the way things have gone since then has proven that out. The other thing, I did charter, there were two chapters chartered that year. The two charter nights were just one night apart. I took one and Bill Chapman, the president-elect, took the other. I elected to go to Reno to charter the Northern Nevada chapter at that time. And it was a very pleasant chore.
Was that chapter in Region 8?
No, that was in Region 10.
Okay, so it wasn't in your home region.
No, it's not in it.
Okay. You were mentioned earlier to me that you were on an R&T committee for a while. Tell me a little bit about your experience at R&T.
You may want to delete this, but I'll tell you one little experience about R&T. When I was on R&T, of course, at that time the headquarters was still in New York, and R&T committee meetings were held sometimes in different places. And Otto Nussbaum, who was on R&T at that time and who recently passed away, convinced the committee that we ought to have a meeting in Atlanta. And so the meeting was set for Atlanta. I left Oklahoma City and flew to St. Louis and connected with a plane to Atlanta to Louisville. I was going to stop at Louisville, Kentucky to talk to one of my TC chairmen before going to the R&T meeting. And after we'd been in the air for about an hour and a half, why, the pilot, this was in April, the pilot came on the air and he said, ladies and gentlemen, he said, it's snowing in Louisville. We are unable to land there. We're going to divert the landing to Indianapolis. We went to Indianapolis, and we were the last plane to land at Indianapolis. I tried to find a number of ways to get out of there to go to Atlanta, and finally I called the railroad terminal and asked if there was a plane out to Chicago or St. Louis or any place where I could make plane connections to Atlanta. They said there was a train going to St. Louis. So I had a tough time convincing a cabbie to take me from the airport to the train station down in Indianapolis, and I thought when I got there I would have dinner, and I got in the station, and I think there were 14 ticket stalls in the station. There was only one of them that was operating. The dining room was a big sign on the door, this room will close on January 2nd, 2 years earlier than I was there. So I got my ticket and I asked the salesman whether there was a diner on the train to St. Louis, and he kind of laughed and said no. Well, when I got on the train, I realized why. It was a single, other than the baggage and express cars, there was one car, and it was a combination mail car and passenger car. And it had a pot-bellied stove in it to keep you warm. We got partway across Illinois, and we came on a frozen switch, and we had to sit there in the cold for an hour waiting for clearance to use a different line back into St. Louis. Got into St. Louis at 12 o'clock at night, and there wasn't any cabs at the terminal, but there was another gentleman standing there, and he came over to me and said, are you looking for a cab? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, there aren't any here. He said, the firemen had a convention in Memphis, Tennessee, and all of the trains came in about an hour ago, and all the cabs have gone. But he said, I'm a fire chief from a little town out here northwest of St. Louis. And he said, there's a squad car coming in for me. And he said, if you said you want to go to the airport, and I said, he said, I'll give you a ride to the airport. So I got to the airport, or to the hotel there near the airport, and got in. It was, probably about 1:45 or so. And I gave Bellman my key, and said, take my bag up to my room. I'm going to go get a bite to eat. And I headed for what was to be the dining room. And as I got there, they slammed the door shut. It was 1 o'clock, and all service had stopped. So I got up the next morning and got an early plane direct from St. Louis to Atlanta, and got to the R&T meeting, and behold, our host who had convinced us we should come to Atlanta was not there. He had moved to a job up in New York and had not said anything to anybody about it, and nobody knew where he was. That was one of my experiences with R&T. Mm-hmm. Non-technical, of course, but an experience.
But what members of ASHRAE do to get to a meeting, right?
Right.
That says a lot about you as a person to get there. That's exactly. I noticed on your jacket under your Presidential Member Award, you have a little gold gavel. What is that from?
Back in 1970, Jack Thompson, again since deceased, and George Meffert and myself met at the winter meeting in Columbus, Ohio, to try to set up some kind of a program that would create a little competition between chapters and get a little bit of activity among the chapters. And we decided on the Golden Gavel Award. And so we instituted that, and what I would do is get it. Each year at the CRC, determination would be made of what chapter was the #1 chapter in the region, based on 12 different categories, and they would win the Golden Gavel. And so what I would do is get a presidential chapter president's pin from the society and take it down to my jeweler and have put a little golden gavel under it. That process continues to this day, and I'll have to say that in 1971 or 71, I believe it was, Frank Bridgers came to our CRC in Houston, and he saw the enthusiasm that this Golden Gavel created, and he had been wondering what he could do to do the same thing on a society level, so he then came up with the idea of the Presidential Award of Excellence. And after I had been president, the region decided that I should have a Golden Gavel under my pin too, so they gave it to me.
That's great. That's great. So through your efforts and the other gentleman's efforts, really the Presidential Award of Excellence was developed.
That's right, and not only that, but the thing that we wanted to do was to have other regions emulate us. We weren't just trying to work within our own region. We wanted to help the society, and a number of the other regions, in fact, maybe all of them now have a similar award. It may not be called that, but they do have an award.
Can you tell me about some people you've encountered along the way that had an influence on you?
Well, I think I mentioned most of them already.
Okay.
Back in the early days, Rex Vernon, followed by Art Hess from Los Angeles. Art was the first president, who was the only man who was ever president of all three societies, ASHRAE, ASA, and ASHRAE.
Wow.
And Art was quite a gentleman, and he kept me interested in ASHRAE. I'd also have to mention John Doob, who I mentioned before, and Frank Bridgers. I'd say, and I've got to mention Jim May from Louisville, Kentucky as well. But those five, I would say, have had an impact on my interest in ASHRAE.
What kind of advice would you give to a college graduate today wanting to enter our field?
I would say that he should, of course, he ought to be made a student member of ASHRAE while he's still in college, and then he ought to stay in the field, and because there are wonderful opportunities in this area, in this discipline, and but you've got to get interested and get into things and do it. You only get out of it what you put in, and you've got to put something into it. In fact, we had a keynote speaker at a meeting, summer meeting in Nassau back in 1972, he was from a radio station in St. Louis, and his keynote speech was put a little something back. And certainly that's true. In fact, one of our past presidents once said, I can't exactly say what he said, but to paraphrase it, he said, no man has the right to withhold from the business or industry from which he earns his living any help. He's got to take a part in it.
Good. What have you been doing since your term as president? You were president in 75 and 76. I'm sure that there have been a lot of things you've been involved with, a lot of committees.
Oh, I've been on the nominating committee, the long-range planning committee, the honors and awards committee. Most recently on the, as I said, I was on several ad hoc committees, and the one I'm serving on now is the Centennial Committee. I've been on it, I think, since it was organized, and of course that ad hoc will ultimately die out by virtue of the calendar, and I'm also on the Journalist Insight Committee.
Sounds like you've been really involved in ASHRAE, I mean, your entire career. I mean, a lot of people would think, gee, you've done your duty, you've been president, and then that's it. And you've been involved for another 15 plus years since that time.
I can give you the answer to that in one word.
What's that?
People.
The people in our society.
The people in ASHRAE. They're the finest people in the world.
I would agree with you, 100%.
When I first joined ASHRAE, the president would come around and visit every chapter throughout the year. And of course, we learned a little bit Saturday about the way things have changed over the years. And what I found with my committee work, since I started early on committees, that there was never a president that I couldn't go up and talk to and ask questions and get an answer. And within just a few minutes, we would be on a first-name basis. There was never one. And I can't say that about a number of the other societies I belong to. And I hope that situation still exists today, although today's president is a lot busier than he was back in those days.
I think it's still pretty much the same. Most of you can go up and talk to.
Right.
It continues on. Are there any closing remarks you'd like to say? Anything else you'd like to express today?
Well, all I can say is that I've enjoyed my work in ASHRAE, and I hope I can continue it.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for participating in the Leadership Recall program that the Historical Committee is conducting. Thank you again.
Thank you.